North Carolina inches closer to pistol purchase permit repeal. Plus, the Heritage Foundation's Amy Swearer discusses President Biden's new executive order on guns. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and pick up a membership today if you want to support our reporting and get insight into all of what's going on with guns in America. You can also sign up for our free newsletter if you want to check out what we're about before you make the commitment to becoming a member. But if you become a member, you'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting that you won't get anywhere else on this planet. And this week on the show, we are discussing President Biden's new executive order on guns, what the details are, what it means, where everything's going. And we've got a special guest with us today, the Heritage Foundation's Amy Swearer. Welcome to the show, Amy. Welcome back. You've been on once before. We're happy to have you back.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Can you tell people a little bit more about yourself? I think you just got done this week doing some congressional testimony. I think you have another one scheduled, so you're pretty busy lately. We appreciate you making some time, but give people a little bit more background about yourself.
Sure. So I am a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation in our EDME Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Most of my scholarship focuses on the Second Amendment, on gun policy issues, mental health, the intersection of mental health and gun violence, and a lot of school safety and related things. I just recently was one of the primary authors behind our Heritage ebook, The Essential Second Amendment. It's available for download online. I highly recommend you go check it out. We're really proud of it. We think it's a great product. And the best part is it is free. So go check it out. And I also run the Heritage Foundation's Defensive Gun Use Tracker, which is an interactive database where we track media-verified defensive gun uses. And we tweet about them on the regular. So check us out on Twitter as well.
Absolutely. Well, so President Biden has now issued a new executive order on dealing with firearms. This would be his third, I believe, since he took office. The first two were pretty wide-ranging and significant. The ghost gun ban and the pistol brace ban, which will affect really millions of people. This one is interesting. It deals primarily with federal licensing for firearms dealers and who will have to obtain that license if they want to sell guns at all. And it also deals with a number of other things, FTC report on gun marketing. There's an initiative about the DoD trying to implement policies to affect how guns are sold in the United States potentially. There's a number of other smaller initiatives in there as well. ATF records on federal licensees who've had some sort of violations. They're going to try to release some of those records. There's a kind of a wish list in here of what gun control advocates have wanted for a while in different areas. But I'm interested in your overall take first on what you think this means. Is this as significant, as aggressive as the previous two executive orders that the president put out?
Well, I think it's trying to be as aggressive as the president can be at this point. He sort of used up a lot of his available tools with the last two recent rule changes with the ATF. And so there's not a whole lot more that realistically he can reach for. Though I think the extent to which this can be viewed as aggressive, if you will, is really going to depend on what these actual rules look like. The way that these executive orders work is that the president just sort of says, hi, agency X, Y, and Z, I want you to promulgate a rule doing this, or to issue a report doing that, or to take strides to do this general idea. But then the agency itself has to go and promulgate that rule, which we don't know what that means or what that looks like until we actually get it. Now, with some of these, I think there is certainly a potential that the agency ultimately could come out with a rule that is quite problematic. But there's also potential that it turns out to be a big nothing burger, if you will, and it really just depends. But that's I think what's interesting is how far it could potentially go once we get those agency rules out.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation of what we're seeing here, right? It's not like the previous two where he was. Of course, the details of the rulemaking process and those mattered quite a lot as well. But it was fairly clear straight from the go that he was going to push these policies as aggressively as possible with trying to redefine what a firearm is, to eliminate, basically homemade firearm making tools and parts, and then that he was basically going to try and reclassify pistol-braced guns as subject to the National Firearms Act and all the complications that come along with that for people who already own them, including potential federal felony charges. But this time around, it does seem like it's less clear exactly what we're going to get out of this executive order and exactly what these directives from the president are going to result in as far as the rules that these agencies come up with. But let's start with what the president focused on, which is this idea of trying to get closer to universal background checks. That's how he put it. He was saying that, within the bounds of current law, we're going to try to get as close to requiring background checks on all sales as we possibly can. And it seems the tactic he's going to use for that is changing what qualifies somebody as in the business of doing of selling guns, and therefore needing a federal license, a federal firearms license, an FFL. What's your view on that rule? How close can he actually push to universal background checks through requiring people to get FFLs?
Yeah, so let's take a step back and talk about just very briefly what federal law currently is, because to a large extent, the president can't just override federal law and unilaterally mandate, well, look, if you transfer a gun, you need to have a background check. So Congress has for several decades now already had in place a series of statutes that essentially says if you are engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, you have to get a federal firearms license. And then it tells these FFL holders, anytime you transfer a gun to a prospective buyer, before you do that, you have to conduct a background check, period. And so the question becomes, okay, well, who is or is not engaged in the business of dealing in firearms? Right. There is a pretty lengthy definition of what that means. But it's still not very clear. It's not really an objective test, right? Where it's like if you sell 10 firearms this year, you are engaged in the business. Right. Or if you made $1,000 last month, you're engaged in the business. It's quite subjective. And so I think the goal here from the Biden administration is to promulgate rules that to the greatest extent possible include the most amount of people as possible under this definition of what it means to be engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, so that if they want to engage in sales or transactions or transfers of firearms, they can't do so as a private seller, because if you're a private unlicensed seller, you can sell or transfer guns to a resident of your same state without a background check and without all of the other record-keeping requirements. And I think the issue here is not necessarily that the president wants thousands more people to go and get their federal firearms license. I think it's really that he wants to sort of put the kibosh on people feeling like they can engage in what would be otherwise lawful sales without going through an FFL, because they just don't know. Right. So I think that's really where you get this sort of chilling effect. Again, it will be interesting to see what this rule looks like when it comes out, whether it will try to put in some objective factors, something to the extent of, if you sold more than 5 guns, right? If you made more than $500. And I think he has a little bit more room to do that than previous administrations, because if you recall, last year, Congress passed the bipartisan gun safety bill. And as part of that, they just very, very
they changed the definition.
They changed that definition just ever so slightly. It wasn't entirely clear what that definition change accomplished, but I think it gives the Biden administration it gives them room to just sort of latch onto that, to say, well, look, we need to help define and clarify what Congress meant here. And so I think that's where we might run into trouble with this chilling effect.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? Because this reminds me a lot of a 2016 executive order from President Obama, where they basically did the same thing. They tried to tighten the interpretation of what it means to be in the business for in regards to obtaining one of these licenses. And even at that point, they said, even if you're just selling one gun, you could be in the business. They didn't, but it still fell back on this sort of. It really comes down to like what they can prove in court, whether a judge will buy that somebody was actually in the business when they sold a gun that DOJ is prosecuting them over.
Right.
And I think that's still going to be largely the case, but I don't think that executive order really accomplished much in practice during the Obama administration. I don't think there was a sea change in how that law was enforced. And I'm skeptical that there will be for this one too. But you're right that there is this extra complication that the definition in the law did change slightly. Basically, they removed the word livelihood. So used to talk about livelihood and profit being your main goal with selling guns. That's when you're engaged in the business. And they really, ATF has a whole list of factors they consider, whether you have a storefront, right? That's a pretty straightforward one. If you have a storefront and you're selling guns out of it, you're probably engaged in the business of selling guns. If you have a business name, you make business cards that say Bob's Guns, you're probably in the business, right? If you're going and constantly cycling through guns, just buying them to resell them, to flip them, you might be, that's going to be a factor that they would consider as being engaged in the business. But it doesn't really come down to, in practice, oh, you sold X number of guns or you made this amount of money. Now, this new standard removes livelihood from that definition.
Right.
And so maybe it's more forgiving to the government in this case, and maybe that will be able to implement a broader interpretation of what it means to be engaged. But I don't know. I read those two clauses. You still have to be predominantly seeking profit while selling guns. So I don't know how much it's really changed. And I guess that's what will be interesting to see how they approach this.
Yeah, and I think too, from a practical standpoint, right? The problem, regardless of what ATF does here, is that it needs to be promulgated in such a way that it has this chilling effect, right? Because I think most people who are looking at selling guns either one don't realize that background checks are a thing for private sales already, or if they do, right, they understand that, okay, well, I'm not an FFL, but they're not necessarily looking at the technical definitions. And the reality is already these are not cases that are widely prosecuted because they're widely disobeyed. So there's sort of a practical problem here of a lot of times you can only prosecute people after they've unlawfully engaged in the business without a federal firearms license, and then someone went on and used that gun in a crime, and then they tracked it back to this transfer, and then they looked around and said, oh, and also this person is selling guns out of his garage without background checks all the time, and then they go after that person. So again, I think from a practical perspective, the biggest issue could potentially be that chilling effect, but that's even at risk if this is not widely understood by the general population that this has been changed in that way. And so I think, if anything, that might make, again, we don't have the rules, but if that's the goal, I think that might push the DOJ into wanting the most restricted. They want this to make headlines. They want your average American to sit there and go, oh shoot, I can't sell guns unless I get I can't transfer part of my collection to my grandkid unless I get a license. I think they want that headline news, and so I think that probably pushes me toward assuming they will go as restrictive, or I guess in this case, as inclusive as they can with that definition. But again, we will see.
Yeah, and I do think that a lot of it does come down to just whatever they do, whatever they say the standard is going to be. A lot of it will come down to practical implications of actually enforcing something like that, because these aren't sexy crimes for federal prosecutors, right? It's just like, it reminds me a lot of straw purchases, right? Everyone agrees. There's really no controversy over the idea of prosecuting straw purchases, which is when somebody buys a gun for someone else that they know can't legally own one. A criminal, their girlfriend or brother or whoever goes out and buys the gun under their name because they've got a clean record, but it's really to give it to the criminal, who then uses it for nefarious purpose. And there's really no controversy over prosecuting those sorts of cases, but it still doesn't really happen that often. It's not a top priority, because these are not cases that you make a career on as a prosecutor in the federal government. They want to go after big networks of criminals and drug cartels and drug dealing networks and gangs and so forth. And these are low level crimes for a lot of these prosecutors. And so there's a constant issue with getting them to even take on these cases. And I think courts will be pretty skeptical of trying to drag in like Johnny who flipped a gun and made it $500, because he didn't have an FFL when he did it.
Yeah, and he sold it to his best friend with a concealed carry permit, who he knows isn't a felon, sort of thing.
Right. So there are, even if that language change from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that changes the mind of DOJ, and they're willing to try and push things further, I think courts will be pretty skeptical of these cases as well, depending on who they choose to go after. There's probably some low-hanging fruit out there that, you described before, where it's going to be something that most people would agree this person should be prosecuted. But, there are very much practical limitations to how far they can push things on this front. They're not going to get, I wouldn't say, to universal background checks like the president is talking about, right? I mean, am I off base there?
No. I mean, because again, the president cannot unilaterally just declare through, the ATF or the Department of Justice that, any transfer now, no matter what, that requires a background check, which is normally what people mean with background checks. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, this could be so broad that in their minds, they will consider any sale for even $1 of profit to be, a sale predominantly for profit. And so therefore you should have had a license. And, but again, I think that probably there's sort of a balancing act for the Department of Justice, because the more outrageous they try to get with this, I think the easier it is to challenge that this is actually trying to override Congress's, clear definition. So it's a balancing act for them. And again, I think we will learn a lot more about how that comes out for the DOJ with that balancing act once we get the language.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on to some of the other aspects of this executive order, because it's kind of a hodgepodge of things in there. What's one of the other areas where you're concerned? I know that we were talking beforehand, and the DoD contracts is an area that you could see potentially having a wider effect.
Yeah, so I think there are three other ones that stuck out. So one is President Biden directs the Department of Defense to essentially come up with a set of principles and factors they want to use when to implement sort of gun safety principles when the DoD acquires guns for the military. Now, on the one hand, that sounds like a bit of a word salad, and it is. On the other hand, I think it's pretty clear that the intent there is to have the DoD essentially with these principles say, look, we are not going to buy guns for the military from companies or contractors that do not implement X, Y, and Z gun control policies, of their own accord, even though it's not mandated by law. For example, we will not acquire small arms from a company that does not, on the civilian side of their sales, require someone to be 21 or wait 10 days, impose their own waiting periods,
right?
Or those sorts of things, or who sells quote assault weapons to in states where they're not prohibited. Those sorts of things.
Right. Or invest into smart gun technology or whatever.
Right.
This is that. I think if you're old enough, I guess, might recall the Smith & Wesson deal with the Clinton administration, where in exchange for backing off of the sort of frivolous lawsuit endeavors that people had gone on, Smith & Wesson had agreed to invest into smart gun technology. And that, that's actually, I think, leads into one of the major hurdles that any plan like that with the DoD is going to face, which is that that almost bankrupted Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson almost went out of business because of the backlash to that, to agreeing to that deal. And that their CEO had to resign. It was a total mess. And I don't think any gun company today would actually go through with something like that unless their plan was to never sell guns outside of the military ever again.
Right. Which I mean, realistically, there have been some companies in recent years that have said we are going to move toward focusing more exclusively on military and police and government sales. Whether or not that has worked out for them, I will not be the arbiter of truth in that regard. But I think it's very clear that for some of them that has not worked out.
Yeah.
But I think you also have, so you have that problem, right? Of on the civilian gun control side, you have the government trying to, in a roundabout way, impose gun control that it can't get through the democratic process.
Right.
But on the other hand, this is actually a national security issue. Like if this rule turns out as a worst case scenario where it really is not just a word salad, but the government really saying the DoD will not acquire small arms from any company that doesn't do this, you're now limiting national security choices based on companies' willingness to impose gun control instead of on which company has the best firearms for our military. And I think realistically, this turns out not to be a nothing burger per se, but to be less of an issue. I think it's easy for the DoD to at least try to say that they're doing something here because they already just recently signed a deal with, I think, Sig Sauer for the next generation combat firearms. So realistically, they're not going to be making mass acquisitions of that nature for potentially decades, unless something goes horribly south. So it kind of like takes it off their shoulders. Like, we don't have to acquire new weapons contracts for several decades, but if we did, we wouldn't consider it unless the companies did X, Y, and Z. Again, it's.
Although, I think even that would be super problematic for DOT, right? Like, do you really want to alienate an entire political party and hundreds of millions of Americans?
Oh yeah.
For this, like, I understand that certainly it does seem that would be the goal of something like this from the Biden administration, is to get DOD to try and backdoor, gun control through their acquisition process. But it also reminds me a lot of these strict gun control laws in places like California or Illinois or anywhere really that there are bans on magazines or certain kinds of guns what you always see is the police being exempted from those bans because they don't want to have to use the guns that that are still legal. Like California is the perfect example of this, right? The handgun roster, the unsafe handgun roster they have in
They're
California.
so unsafe that only cops can have them.
Exactly. He's got this whole list of you can't have a handgun unless it's got a magazine safety or a loaded chamber indicator, and whatever. People can debate whether they like those features or not, or whether they, obviously the big one is microstand because it's not a technology that actually exists in practice anywhere. No guns in the world have that technology incorporated into them, and it's questionable as to whether they even could. But the police get exemptions from these things. They get exemptions because the police don't actually want to be forced to use those sort of guns, and so. That's what this reminds me of. Like the military isn't going to want to actually use smart guns in the vast majority of situations because of the shortcomings of that, the inherent shortcomings of adding like biometrics into a safety mechanism or what have you. There's a lot of things in that realm, or try to limit the design, and I think they'll get in a lot of. That'll create a lot of political problems for DOD if they start trying to use acquisitions in this highly political way.
Well, I think you bring up a good point. I immediately went to the assumption is that this is going to try to be backdoor gun control, and not that this is going to be trying to implement those principles on the military or police themselves, because that would just be so absurd. It is intuitively absurd that the government would ever, that any soldier in combat would be like, yeah, you know what I really want is a gun that may or may not work with smart technology. That if I need to pick up my buddy's gun, right, because I'm out of ammo or he's down, well, now I can't use it because it doesn't have my fingerprint. Right. Or, that has a magazine
lock. Or the fingerprint reader is wet if you've ever used the cell phone.
Right. Or it has a magazine lock, so I can't quickly change out my mag. Right. No government agent, whether it's military or civilian side, is going to want that. So I don't even think it crossed anybody's mind that that's what the word salad meant, because you're right, it is so absurd. But then they flip around and say, but these are the strategies we want to implement on the civilian side.
Yeah, we want to force this
because
on
you guys, it doesn't matter. If you're in a life or death situation and the government isn't there to protect you, well, that's fine if your gun doesn't work. But for us, we're really special. So,
but that's one potential risk or like potentially aggressive angle they could go is this DoD path, regardless of these shortcomings we're talking about. What was, you had two more. What were the other two?
So I think one of the other ones, it was a directive for the Department of Transportation to, I forget the exact wording, but essentially do something, look at doing something about thefts and losses of firearms being transferred between FFLs when in commerce, right? So when they're being shipped from manufacturers to gun stores or being stolen from gun stores. And to an extent, this is a problem. I don't think anyone would seriously suggest it's not a bad thing that guns are stolen in transit. That said, it's a minor part of the overall problem. So I think it's like several thousand guns a year that are reported missing or lost in transit or from gun stores due to theft or loss or anything. But some of the numbers suggest that there are potentially over 100,000 guns in total that get stolen around the nation. So it's very clearly a very small part of that problem. I think most guns that are getting stolen and winding up on the black market are from people leaving their guns unlocked in cars, or their house is getting broken into and their guns stolen that way. So it's definitely an issue. But I think the concern here is, again, what is the worst case scenario that we could expect from an administration that is trying to find ways to make guns more expensive and impose more burdens on Second Amendment rights. And so I think some of those scenarios could include I mean, yeah, if you stretch it to its limit and say, for example, in order to prevent firearm thefts and loss in transit, FFLs and manufacturers can only ship firearms in special armored train cars with 25 armored guards minimum and are presumed responsible for any losses that occur, and it's a felony, right? All of a sudden, this has a chilling effect on manufacturing and guns actually being marketed to the public,
Right.
because you have this problem of that becomes a tremendous burden on the manufacturing side. And even if it can be met, that this is realistic, those costs get passed on to the consumer. So it becomes a de facto tax. So that's, again, I'm not suggesting that is exactly what will happen, but it's certainly, I think, within the realm of possibilities that this is used not just as a legitimate means of trying to prevent loss, but as a backdoor means of imposing on the manufacturing side taxes and burdens that then get passed on to consumers or run certain, some of the smaller FFLs out of business because they just can't comply.
Yeah. Yeah, it does feel like there's the possibility that this could be a sort of Operation Choke Point-esque program where they're just pressuring carriers not to ship guns, basically, which would just gum up the whole supply chain for gun dealers throughout the country and gun manufacturers. You've already seen some of the major carriers implement anti-gun policies. UPS has refused to carry guns unless they're shipped between FFLs, I believe, recently. So, depending on exactly what they do here, it could have a significant effect on, how guns are actually moved around the country and the whole commerce of firearms. Now, I think that would probably run into some significant legal issues, I'd imagine, if they do try to go extremely aggressive in that realm. But yeah, I think that makes sense as a potential worst case scenario, right, for gun owners from this particular section of that policy. What was the next one?
So I think the final thing that really stood out, though I think there is less control over what the FTC does, is the Biden administration highly suggested to the Federal Trade Commission, because it can't direct the Federal Trade Commission, to issue a report, to do an investigation and issue a report into the advertising practices of the gun industry, gun manufacturers, gun sellers, specifically with respect to two things. So with respect to advertising guns to minors and then advertising guns to anyone based on, quote, military characteristics. So this has been something that we've seen time and time again from gun control advocacy groups and even from this administration, is this idea that the gun industry in recent decades has sort of gone rogue and has focused on these militaristic functions. They want to push out to civilians that, you too can be an army of one, and that somehow this facilitates civilians wanting to engage in mass murder, which, the logic wasn't always connecting there, but that inherently militaristic features are bad. We shouldn't be promoting them, and so therefore we should sort of expose the gun industry for pushing these features.
Right behind the Sandy Hook lawsuit, right? This is, I think, why you see a lot of emphasis put on this in recent years, because that lawsuit ended in a successful settlement for the plaintiffs, even though, obviously they were settling with the insurance company, not Remington, because Remington went bankrupt and had its assets sold off. But,
yeah, and the insurers just wanted to be done with it.
Sure, but it was a successful example of this tactic of trying to hold gun companies liable for mass shootings or just general gun crime, which is something they've been trying to do since the 90s. Actually, this again goes back to that Smith & Wesson situation was part of that. And so, but they haven't really had a lot of success with that. And this Remington settlement, the Sandy Hook settlement, is probably the best they've done, even though it's not an actual court ruling on the merits. They never got that far. But the argument that survived long enough to get to a settlement was that the marketing of the guns and their use in military video games and elsewhere was contributed to the Sandy Hook shooting. Obviously, there's serious pitfalls with this argument because the shooter didn't buy that gun. His mother did, and then he murdered his mother and took the gun. And there was no evidence he actually saw any of these advertisements that they're talking about. But
or that again that somehow the militaristic advertising then promotes inherently will just go shoot people indiscriminately.
Right. There's obviously a lot of arguments about the merits of this claim, but it was successful enough to get to that settlement. And so you're seeing a lot of legislation and efforts and lawsuits built around this basic argument now. And that's where this FTC thing plays into all this, right?
Right. Yeah. And again, I don't know what the FTC will do because at least my understanding is that the president can't, as he can for other agencies, there's a little bit more independence with the FTC, so he can't just order them to do this.
Right.
So he strongly suggests it. There's always the possibility that the FTC does it. And I think
Democrats have been pushing for that too.
Right.
There have been senators pushing for it. And I think the idea is if they were to release a report that said, I don't know, that this advertising is reckless or something, that then they could use that in court to sue these gun companies.
Yeah, that it might do two things. So one, it might sort of facilitate more lawsuits, right? Because they've essentially done discovery for potential plaintiffs to be like, look, here's all the evidence you need. Go forth and sue. But I think the other thing that could come out of that, right, is that it then becomes it sort of facilitates congressional hearings, right? So Democrats in whatever house that they might control, whenever such report would come out, could potentially use that, or even state level bodies could use that to hold hearings and like, okay, we have to do something about this rogue gun industry. I think the same thing is true with the theme of advertising for minors, right? You'll get like the JR-15, your single shot 22 long rifle with a pistol grip, using that to be like, look, they want kids to have guns and shoot people, which again, there's logical fallacies there, but I think it lends itself to that report being used as ammunition, if you will, no pun intended, for further lawsuits or further lawmaking bodies to
I find it hard to believe
you
didn't intend that pun.
No, it flew right out, and I let it happen. It couldn't be stopped.
Yes, but it's kind of funny actually. The whole advertising to minors thing is really just based around that one single gun and its initial marketing campaign that featured the skull and crossbones with the pacifier marketing that they had. They've actually changed. They've abandoned that now after all the uproar, but I think it probably accomplished the goal of getting them lots of attention.
There
that's kind of the whole thing of the minor advertising, just that one gun.
Well, you'll get a couple of other things, right? So you'll get so after Uvalde, for example,
the Daniel Defense tweet,
right? Daniel Defense, where it was the point of the tweet to any reasonable observer was very clearly train your kids in gun safety when they're young, and they won't be idiots with guns when they're older.
So it was a toddler holding an AR, right?
Yeah. It was
I
like
don't
a
think the goal
child.
was to sell that toddler guns. Whatever you think of whether they should have put any of these advertisements, whatever you think of them as whether they're good.
It very clearly was not, let's give kids guns so that they can go shoot up an elementary school. And I think too, you see it a little bit in the argument of these guns being used in video games that arguably are sold to teens, to minors. I mean, some of them probably just based on video game ratings are not going to very young children.
Well, they shouldn't be, but they,
right. You know,
least.
that kids, minors are playing these games and they're getting used to these guns. But again, you know, for I think at least a decade at this point, it's been a while since any of these video game manufacturers or creators have actually gone to the weapons companies and created deals to use them.
It was really just one game.
Right.
Call of Duty never did it. It was Medal of Honor Warfighter.
Right. And then all of a sudden one of the companies was like, we're just not going to ask you anymore. And
that's why all the
they
games
stopped doing it.
That's why all the guns in the games are real guns, but they're not called the actual names of the gun. They always make up some name for them that isn't what they actually are. Although I've always found that kind of weird, because like it's one thing not to have, oh, this is the Daniel Defense, you know, whatever model AR. It's another thing to say this isn't an M4. This is a, you know, an M53A6. Or it's like, why? I don't. But regardless, that's what they do in video games. Is they put in the real guns, but they don't put in who makes them or their actual names. They really only ever did that in a single game that wasn't terribly popular, to be honest. That's why that was the last game in the Medal of Honor series. It didn't sell very well. But yeah, it's a lot of these things hinge on like single example arguments. Like the JR-15 is their one argument for why, you know, for how bad advertising is of guns to children. And then, Medal of Honor Warfighter is like their one example of a video game that used actual real world names for the guns involved. But anyway, we're getting a little bit off track. The point is they want to try and get the FTC to issue a report so that they can use that in efforts to sue the industry and then also for congressional hearings, like you said, right?
Right.
And so the last thing I want to get into here is, I guess, just a broader view of this executive order. Because to me, and we may disagree on this, but I look at it and I see a president at the limits of what he can really do on his own unilaterally. Like he's already taken all the gray areas that existed before and pushed through as far as he possibly can on them with the redefinition of what a firearm is to go after unfinished parts, and the reclassification of pistol-braced ARs and other guns as short-barrel rifles needing registration under the NFA. And now he's more trying to, this feels more symbolic. I know that we've just talked about the potential, furthest pushing aspects of these things that they could try to do, but also all the reasons why perhaps that wouldn't get anywhere. I mean, I think the FTC thing even would start to run up against like First Amendment issues in addition to Second Amendment issues if they tried to just ban gun advertising outright or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know that the FTC unilaterally could do that as much as, they just want that report.
How do you see it? Do you think it's, is this as aggressive? Is this a sign that he's becoming boxed in on this issue?
Well, I think it's certainly a sign that like he, from the outset, has been probably the most vocally pro-gun control president in history.
Sure.
This has always been from the beginning his plan to cater to gun control advocacy groups. And so on the one hand, I think you are correct that generally speaking, he used up most of his like very clearly, readily available tools with the two other ATF rules. That was those were the two most obvious ways of going after, at least on a wide scale and a direct scale, going after gun owners and gun ownership, and making life more difficult. So at this point, he is just trying to get those little edges that he can. Now that said, I again, having just spent however many minutes going over potential worst case scenarios, I don't want to make it seem as though in those worst case scenarios, it's not a big deal. Sure. Because I think those can have far reaching effects, but they are in less direct, less obvious ways. And it is getting to a point where he's having to just sort of, start cutting around the edges as much as he can to continue making it look like he's consistently, routinely trying to make progress in his view on gun control issues.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit of both. And I don't want to just write it off as nothing, because there is some potential there. But it's the general premise is he's taken care of the lowest hanging fruit at this point.
Yeah. Because to me, I look at the overall situation, right? I look and I see he has no chance of as much as he can go out there and say, we're going to pass an assault weapons ban. I did it in the 90s and I'm going to do it again. No, he's not. Like, it's not going to happen in this Congress. It's just, there's no chance of that. There's really no chance of him getting anything he would want on guns from this Congress, even because it's an even harder sell than it was in the last Congress, where he did get that bipartisan bill that we could talk at length about, but is relatively minor as far as what he actually wants.
It's certainly not an assault weapons bill, right?
Right. And so he's got no real legislative hope of passing his agenda. And then at the same time, he's done these two previous ones that were much more aggressive, but they're on track to be blocked. I mean, one is already almost completely blocked. The ghost gun rule is now blocked for defense distributed. It doesn't apply to defense distributed, which is one of the most important companies out there that make unfinished parts or tools to finish unfinished parts and so forth. It seems likely that it'll get struck down altogether in a short order here in the Fifth Circuit. Just had the bump stock ban, which obviously was Trump, not Biden, but is something that I'm sure he's supports and is really modeling these other executive orders after.
I think if that got struck down, it actually might be considered a loss for him, because people don't necessarily connect that, with a previous administration.
Right. But I just, they're using basically the same logic from the bump stock ban to apply to the ghost gun ban and the pistol brace ban. These are all basically the same rulemaking process and the same thinking in each of them. And it's really bad sign for the pistol brace ban that the bump stock ban has been struck down by the Fifth Circuit. I don't see any of these three making it, into force here, into effect for much longer. And now, you look at this latest executive order and it just seems more like, oh, I'm suggesting these certain things that when you look at them, there are some possibilities that it could go in a very aggressive direction. But to me, feels like a signal that he's really at the end of what he can do on his own. But I don't want to downplay it either. But that's where I come down on, when he released this, they tried to make a big deal about it, and I looked at it and I thought, this is actually, it shows the limits of what he can really do. He's already at that. But I'll have more on that in a members piece here for the Reload. If people want to check that out, that'll be out soon. So it should be out by the time this podcast goes up. But yeah, so maybe, I don't know. I might be even less worried about it than perhaps you are. I don't know.
Yeah, and again, it's hard with an administration that has been so vocally anti-gun and so very clear from the beginning that they want to do whatever they can to make this difficult for law-abiding gun owners and make it difficult on the lawful gun industry, that I almost have to assume they're going to stretch for the limits of what they can do, even if it's not quite, worst case scenario. That, again, even though this is largely, I think, wanting to make it seem like they are continuing to do something on guns, and there are clearly limits to the something that they can do. I think they are trying to push it to those limits. But again, I think all of that will be up for a conversation when we see what the actual language is from these rules.
Yes.
And I look forward to that conversation.
Very good point.
And I hope I am wrong. I hope they don't try to stretch it to those limits, because those limits could be very problematic.
Yeah, we will have to see exactly how this turns out, if they even do rulemaking for some of this stuff, or if it just ends up being guidance that maybe DOJ puts out on FFL compliance or what have you. But yeah, that's something legitimately we'll have to actually see what they try to put through. And perhaps we can have you back on once they're in that process, once we get through to some of the details, the further details of this, so that we can judge where exactly they came down. But until then,
we'll see who came closest in horseshoes here.
Yes, there we go. We'll have to put a wager on it somehow. But no, I mean, it's obviously a more serious note. It will really matter what the details are. The devil's always in the details with these things, and we'll have to circle back. This isn't the end of it, right? You can read the fact sheet, but the fact sheet is a guidance. It's not what's actually going to be in the rules, and that's what's going to determine whether this is as aggressive as it could be in practice. And so that's a really good point that you made. We'll have to have you back on at that point, I think, to maybe go over exactly how these things turn out. But until then, where can people find more of your writing or see more of your work?
Well, you can always follow me on Twitter at Amy Swearer, and you can see what I'm up to and what my colleagues are up to on a wide variety of issues at heritage.org or on our multimedia arm, which is thedailysignal.com.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to head on over to our news update segment now. All right, it's time for our news update segment with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How you doing this week, Jake?
I'm doing pretty good, Steve. How are you?
I'm all right. Things are going pretty well. Busy week. Just scheduled a new concealed carry class, and I'm finally going to get my DC and Maryland permits, because I've held off on I went through the whole DC process years ago, and it was a mess. And it was when they first passed their May issue law, and then that got struck down, and then I got caught in sort of a bureaucratic mess doing that, and then I just didn't put the effort into sorting everything out. So now I'm gonna go ahead and finally do that and get my Maryland permit at the same time.
Some would say that bureaucratic mess is a feature, not a bug, of the DC permitting system.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and I will say that making it more complicated or work intensive to get a permit does actually keep people from doing it. Because, for instance, I'm also re-upping my Pennsylvania non-resident permit, because Pennsylvania's governor, when he was the attorney general, had broken the reciprocity deal that Pennsylvania and Virginia had. So Virginia's licenses, which I have a regular resident permit in Virginia. I've had that for a long time, but that's recognized in 35 other states, but not Pennsylvania. And that was like the one state that he revoked the reciprocity deal with. So, and it's also the only other state that I really ever go and carry in, because that's where I'm originally from, for anyone who hasn't figured that out from looking at the background here on the on the YouTube show. But I had a non-resident permit for 5 years, and then it expired during the pandemic, and they weren't accepting renewals in Delaware County from non-residents at the time, because it expired in 2020, I believe, if I remember correctly. And then Wolf, the governor at the time, had done this legally questionable thing but nobody was like too upset about it, where he just sort of extended the expiration dates of all the concealed carry permits for like another year and a half, but I still wasn't able to actually go and renew it. So now I have to apply for a new one. Much less complicated process in Pennsylvania, but you basically just have to pass a background check and pay them $20. But
yeah,
for a long time, it's a county-based thing, right? It's each county sheriff's office, I believe, does the processing. And they all have different policies about whether they'll issue to non-residents or not. And they all started moving to an online system finally during the pandemic. And it has sort of conflicting statements in there in some of these about whether you can get a non-resident. So I applied for one of those too in Delaware County. And we'll see. I'm still waiting to hear back on that one. They have like 45 days. But in Maryland, I'm doing, because you can finally actually get the Maryland permit,
right,
in real life. And I found a class where you can take one class to qualify for DC, Maryland, and Virginia instead of having to take, 3 different classes that all cost $300. So I'm going to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Well, good luck on your quest to navigate the bureaucratic hurdles.
I'll keep you guys all updated on how well that works out. Because then after you do, that's just the training part, right? You got to do the training, which itself is like several classes over several days, some online, some in person. There's range portions. It's a pretty high bar for training in Maryland and DC. And so you got to jump through a bunch of extra hoops. Virginia's is pretty, you can get the Virginia one alongside these two just because Virginia's requirements aren't as extensive, we'll say. You need a training course, unlike Pennsylvania, and you need to pass a background check, and it's like $50. But you don't need to. DC requires like a 16-hour class with 2 hours of range time, which is hard to do if you live in DC because there aren't any actual public ranges there. But regardless, this class is a bit of a shortcut in the sense that you don't have to take several separate classes that teach you the same exact stuff, but comply with just one set of requirements. And so this one hits all of the requirements in one class. It's going to take a while, but it should be good by the end. And, Maryland is on the way to passing, of course, one of these Bruin response bills that's going to make it impossible, I'm sure, to carry most places. DC was the old strictest version, but you can still carry in a lot of places. They do have bizarre rules, like they have roving gun-free zones that follow around anyone under diplomatic protection. So if you ever see one of those convoys, the motorcades driving around, you're supposed to run away from it or something, because there's a gun-free zone that follows it around wherever it goes. Same for protests, although they've done some of this stuff in Virginia too. So, and these are just kind of security theater things, because how would they ever know? Or
right.
What are the, like, it's just kind of dumb concepts, but stuff you have to deal with if you want to carry in DC or Maryland. And so I want to get the permits while I can and see what happens from there, because the most dangerous place I ever go really is Philadelphia and DC. And right now I can't legally carry it in those places. So it'd be nice if I could do that. Yeah,
no kidding.
You got any plans? Anything interesting? I know you went shooting. How was the trip?
I was going to say, I took a buddy of mine out. He just got his first pistol, so he was pretty excited to shoot it for the first time. It's a SIG P320, and we went out last Saturday and spent about 2.5 hours at the range, and it was a great time. And he was totally stoked to be a new gun owner. So that was really cool to see. And speaking of, it is always, right? It's always fun to see people, fall in love with something that you enjoy doing as a hobby, especially because this wasn't someone that grew up around guns, and he's just sort of getting into it in adulthood, and it's always cool to see. Yeah,
I'm taking some of my friends with me to do the CCW class, so that'll be good too. And I'm trying to get, I think I'll try to get a new carry gun. I think I'm going to do the 320X macro, perhaps. Although, of course, there's DC has a magazine limit, so I want to get the X macro because it has better capacity, but then I can't actually carry that in DC. Well, I'd have to carry it with 10-round magazines or whatever.
Right.
We'll see.
Yeah, the pitfalls of all the different laws.
Yeah, it's there's all kinds of stuff you got to think through if you want to carry in the DMV. But speaking of new pistol purchases, like your friend there, we got a story out in North Carolina. You've been following this for a while now. The pistol purchase permit debate down there has heated up, and now they've actually passed a bill, right?
That's right. Yeah. So they're back again with a repeal bill that they sent to Governor Roy Cooper's desk. Listeners may recall that something similar happened in 2021, but Cooper vetoed that bill. Mm-hmm. Back then, the state legislature didn't have the votes to override the veto, so that was sort of, that was the end of that. But now, after the midterms, North Carolina Republicans actually have a veto-proof majority in the Senate, and they're one vote shy in the House. But this bill actually cleared with those veto-proof votes. I believe 3 Democrats joined House Republicans in passing that bill along to Governor Cooper. So now it's sort of a little bit of a standoff to see what's going to happen next. By all counts, Cooper's probably going to veto it again. There's nothing to suggest that he suddenly supports it. And we're going to have to see if those 3 Democrats and even some of the Republicans are going to stick to their guns, so to speak, and vote to override this.
Yeah. So they're certainly closer than they've ever been to repealing this Jim Crow era permit purchase law that's been criticized for disproportionate enforcement against African Americans. Basically, this was passed in the wake of race riots back in 1919. And, in an era in the South where, there was quite a lot of effort to keep Black people from owning guns, just to be straightforward. Now, this law wasn't explicitly racist like some of the predecessors, but it has been criticized for the effects that it had, that it seems officials used it to target African Americans. And still, really to this day, there's a disparity there, right?
Yeah, there's a 2021 North Carolina Law Review article that actually kind of looked at some data, I believe, from Wake County, which is one of the larger counties in North Carolina. And they found that African-American applicants for these permit to purchase, when they go to their local sheriffs, are denied at something like a 3-to-1 rate from their white counterparts. Right. And obviously, that's not automatically evidence of racial animus or something, but it is at least evidence of a disparity that exists under this law. And supporters of the repeal of this bill are pointing to this as sort of like, hey, look what we've become more conscious of racial disparities as of late. Well, what about this particular policy that still to this day is causing some of those same disparities? Yeah.
And so it's passed with this veto-proof majority, right? That would imply that it has a good chance of making it into law, regardless of what the governor does. However, you wrote in a member's piece this week that might not actually be the case. And there's good reason to think that perhaps it won't survive a veto.
Yeah, that's right. So listeners may recall a effort in 2021 in the state of Louisiana, which there's some similarities here. Louisiana is a fairly red state, but also has a Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards. In 2021, they passed a permitless carry bill with, once again, huge majorities, bipartisan majorities, veto-proof majorities the first time around. Edwards, the entire time when they were debating that bill, said, I'm against this, I'm going to veto it. And sure enough, when it got to his desk, he vetoed it. Then the Louisiana legislature brought it back to the floor to try to do a veto override vote. And not only did the Democrats that voted for the bill defect and not vote for the veto, there were actually 3 Republicans that also voted against a veto override, and 1 Republican who didn't even show up for the veto override vote. So clearly there's precedent where just having veto-proof votes the first time around doesn't guarantee that those folks are going to stand firm and stick to their guns when there's a high-profile override vote. And that very well could play out here in North Carolina.
Yeah. I mean, it was a bit of a debacle down there in Louisiana when that happened. And they even lost Republicans from the veto override vote. I think that there's probably something to be said about the different issues at stake. One was permitless carry. This one's about repealing permit to purchase law that has those sort of racist roots to it. And so maybe it'll be an easier vote for some of these Democrats and the Republicans. Maybe the Republicans are a little more organized in North Carolina than they were in Louisiana during that vote. There's some good reasons to think perhaps they'll make it through. But, like you said there, that's an example of why you don't want to count your chickens before they're hatched, right? Is that the saying? Yeah. Right. So there is good reason to think it might not survive too. I mean, it is one thing. It's probably fairly odd to a lot of people who don't follow politics closely, but it's one thing to vote for a bill and approve of a policy. And it's another thing to vote to override your governor when you're of the same party, especially if they're fairly popular, right? He's polls fairly well right now, doesn't
Yeah,
he?
he's above water for sure. There's even been some polls that find him over 50%, and that's pretty good for a Democratic governor in a otherwise red tilted state.
Yeah. Of course, maybe he'll change his mind. We don't know. Like you said, he hasn't put out statements like Louisiana's governor did during that bill. Obviously, he's vetoed this bill in the past, but perhaps now with more of his party members on board with the bill, he'll back down. It's obviously, I think there's probably a lot of backroom conversations going on right now about
absolutely.
The governor doesn't want to get embarrassed by getting his veto override necessarily, and so he's probably trying to figure out if these Democrats will stay on board. Now, there's one Democrat in particular you think that is the key vote here.
Yeah, he's sort of an interesting test case. So this Representative Michael Ray is his name. He is a Democrat. He actually co-sponsored a House version of a pistol purchase permit repeal bill, which on its face should indicate, wow, he's willing to put his neck out there and actually co-sponsor a bill to do this. He must really support this policy. Well, when it came time for that bill to actually get a floor vote in the House, he actually voted against his own bill because he said that he heard from sheriffs in his local district that said, hey, we're kind of worried about this policy. I don't know if maybe this is a good idea. And so he voted against it. Well, then the Senate bill comes up that combines the pistol purchase permit repeal with a couple of other gun policies, like allowing licensed carry on educational grounds when there's a religious service happening, and a few other policies as well. So this omnibus gun bill goes through and Michael Ray votes for it again. So it's kind of unclear what changed between then and now. Maybe he thought that other policies being involved gave him cover to vote for it. I don't know. But you would seem like he would be the key vote to hold firm. But when he already has a track record of flip-flopping on the issue, it's kind of tough to say one way or another how he's going to react to a veto override vote.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to note, too, this permit to purchase law has been abused in recent years, especially during the pandemic, by some sheriffs who have effectively stopped issuing the permits during certain periods of time during COVID. I remember there was a sheriff in North Carolina who just stopped issuing permit to purchase paperwork. He wouldn't, and there was a wait period that lasted for months and months. So, this is not necessarily something where it's a formality that, I'm sure in most of the state it is. The sheriff's not, it's basically just a background check, which already exists on, sales through licensed dealers anyway. But it can be used to just block all gun sales for at least some period of time. That sheriff got sued over that practice and had to back down, but it took a while for that to clear through the courts. So this isn't necessarily a purely symbolic thing to repeal this law. There is a practical impact on whether people can buy guns in certain counties in the state.
No, that's right. And it was funny that you bring up the sheriff in North Carolina. I think there's one or two, mostly bigger city sheriffs. And it played out very similar to what we've seen in states like Pennsylvania, where during the pandemic, Philadelphia, for example, with its carry permits, first flat out wasn't issuing them, got sued, then they agreed to issue them. But then they would slow walk the application process where it would take months when it's supposed to, under statute, only take a couple. In North Carolina's case, it's supposed to take 2 weeks to hear back on your pistol purchase permit. And so he was slow walking the processing, and then he got sued again. So as you said, there's very, very practical reasons that opponents of the purchase law have to point to say, hey, if all this subjective if sheriffs have the ability to slow walk this process, you can flat out deny someone their right to purchase a gun under this law. So definitely some substantive stuff here.
Yeah. So people should definitely head over to the Reload, and you can either read up on the news story that you wrote, which is free for everyone, or they could check out the members piece if they want to get a little bit deeper dive into the practical aspect of overriding a potential veto in your members piece. So they should head on over to reload.com if they want to check out those pieces and learn more about this situation. But I think that's all we've got for you this week. If you like the show and you want to support our reporting, please like and rate this episode on wherever you're listening to it, on YouTube. You can share it with your friends. That helps us tremendously. And of course, if you want to keep the Reload going, want to help fund our work, you can go over and pick up a membership. It'll enable you, of course, to read those member exclusive pieces that we were just talking about. And you'll also get this podcast a day early, as well as the opportunity to appear on the show. If you're a member who wants to be on the show, please reach out to your Sunday newsletter. That's another thing you get when you're a member of the Reload. You get an extra newsletter on Sundays that gives you some of the analysis of these different events that we do each week, plus early access to the podcast. And just reply to that email and let us know you want to come on the show, and we'll have you on for a member segment, one of my favorite segments that we do. And, of course, you can also review the show on your favorite podcasting app or leave a comment on YouTube. Interact. That's always helps spread the word, as it were. But that's all we've got for you this week. We will be back again next week.